Thank you so much for joining us today for Invisible Weavers, charting the evolving identity of intermediary organizations. I also just wanted to give a shout out to all of our speakers and our staff and team here. There's been a lot going on weather-wise, and you can all be here with us today. So my name is Jamie Sharp. I'm the program manager here at Grantmakers in the Arts. I use she, they pronouns, and today I'm wearing a very colorful jumpsuit, even though it appears to be a top in this view, and I have my lemon earrings. GIA is headquartered on the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. We ask you to join in acknowledging the Lenape and Wappinger communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to the beginning of the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. So as some of you may have noticed today, we're in meeting mode as opposed to webinar, which means folks are able to unmute themselves and come on and off camera. Please just try to stay on mute if you are an attendee. We'll have some time and space for questions, and we will ask people or allow folks to come off of mute to ask their questions if and when there's time. But just throughout the presentation, if you could stay on mute, that would be lovely. And also just take a minute to review the Zoom features so you have an optimal experience with us today. If you have a question for our tech team during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function and message LGC Tech, either Ali or Jess. Otherwise, we don't have a Q&A feature today, so never mind. So you just go ahead and use the chat for anything that you may need. And if you'd like your experience to include live captioning, just select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles. Intermediary organizations like the mycelium play a vital role in connecting, nourishing, and sustaining nonprofits and communities. That's a quote from Vule from Nonprofit AF. In this webinar, we'll explore intermediaries' evolution from their historical roots to their potential future roles. We will dive into their primary functions, examining these organizations' proximity to communities and their deep connections therein, and investigate their critical role in bridging the gap in funding and nurturing the roots of change. Are intermediaries the truly overlooked middle child, and what identities are they clarifying in today's landscape? Today, we are joined by Sage Crump, Kate Fox, and Ron Ragan for a discussion on the significance of membership versus network, the impact of dwindling institutional support, and shedding light on replicating systems of harm under the guise of benevolence. Now, before we introduce our speakers, we would just like to take a moment and ask a few questions of our audience today. So we'll have a link in the chat so you can log on to Mentimeter, or if you visit menti.com and join using the code 37390752. I believe we'll have the chat. There's the link in the chat. But please let us know what type of institution that you are representing today. Are you an intermediary from a service organization, private foundation, public funder, local or state arts agency? Are you an artist or an arts worker or other? So if you use the link in the chat, and just let us know. Pizza asks, what if you fall into 3 categories? I guess which are you most resonating with today? Unfortunately, there's not an option for us to have let people select multiple. Great, so we have a lot of intermediary folks with us today. Awesome. If we go on to our next question, we just want to see, do folks know what an intermediary organization is? So our options are yes, I'm familiar with the term, but I'm not confident in my understanding, or you have no idea. So wonderful. A ton of folks know what an intermediary organization is. So that's lovely. And then we'll go on to our third question, which may take a minute again. But what words come to mind when you think about intermediaries? So if you're able to add it into the Mentimeter, and then it'll show up on the screen for everyone, or if you just want to drop your response in the chat, that's perfectly fine as well. There we go. Getting some words up. Oh. Supportive, yeah. And just uplifting what Jess said in the chat, feel free to refresh your page if the question isn't appearing for you. Oh, 43 responses. Awesome. Okay. I'm seeing knowledgeable, partner, community, large, overlooked, connector, trust, spine, connectivity, linkage, middle person, redistribute, bridge, knowledgeable, advocacy, responsive, mediator, collaborative, community-based. Wonderful. So we have a ton of different words coming up, and I hope that we, through our conversation today, can continue to evolve what words come to mind when folks think of intermediaries. But I did just want to take a moment to share what GIA's definition of an intermediary So an intermediary organization in cultural funding. It is an identity that mediates the relationship between funding resources and cultural recipients. Drawing from Vu Lei's analogy, these organizations are like mycelium, playing a vital role in the cultural funding ecosystem. They manage grants, provide capacity building services, offer technical assistance, and monitor the impact of funding projects. During times of crisis, such as the pandemic, intermediaries become essential hubs of information, resources, and action, ensuring that funds, supplies, and support reach those in need. They mobilize and organize nonprofits to speak up collectively, represent those too occupied to advocate for themselves, and even help organizations at the end of their life cycle, to exit gracefully. Despite their critical functions, intermediaries often struggle with funding due to their missions being perceived as less direct or appealing. Therefore, it is crucial for funders to recognize and increase support for these indispensable organizations, ensuring they have the resources needed to sustain and enhance the cultural sector. And now I would love to introduce our speakers. So we'll get everyone pulled up here in just a second. And I would love to hear from our speakers one assumption that you want to challenge about intermediaries and how this assumption impacts the perception and effectiveness of intermediaries. And I also encourage our attendees to please share in the chat. So I'll give our tech folks just a second. And here we all are. And Ron, I would love to start with you. And I also owe you an apology because I mispronounced your last name. So if you would love to, just go ahead and give us a quick intro.
Oh, how auspicious. Okay, let's get started. My name is Ron Reagan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Tongva lands here in Covina, California, and I am the director
Oh,
of
you escaped.
programs at the Map Fund. I wouldn't say escaped, but I'm enjoying my time here in Cali. I'm sad to not be in the South right now. It's my heart and my home space for sure. And I'm a Black person with brown skin, curly hair, these like fun dangly antenna looking gold earrings, and a collared shirt that is white and looks like a doily, and that I love and makes me think of my grandmother. And there's a guitar hanging in the background. All right. I think that's all the intro stuff. In terms of and just a little bit about Map Fund, we invest in performing artists and their work as the critical foundation of imagining and co-creating a more equitable and vibrant society. We've been doing that in some form or fashion since 1989. We love the risky, the untested, the experimental work, and the artists who steward it so that we can trouble these existing systems and structures of power. And we support those artists through a national open call grant-making program, as well as by offering professional coaching to artists through a program called Scaffolding for Practicing Artists. The assumption I want to challenge today, I think that intermediaries in our role in the broader arts ecosystem are often tasked with equity. Like that's part of why we are supported and funded. It's part of our charge oftentimes. And it's part of why we exist and what we love to do. I think increasingly that is a field-wide truth. And so the assumption I want to challenge is that equity and justice focused work can happen cheaply. This is deeply relational work, the work of analyzing and redistributing power, of connecting and supporting folks, of communicating honestly and transparently, of distributing resources, and also of being available for feedback that's more than a formality, of actually changing what we do in response to what we learn from the communities, the artists, the organizations that we're connected to. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of people, and we want to pay those people well. We want to be equitable toward our staff and toward the folks that we contract with to do this work. And so I think that when our budgets are questioned or when our funding is like, why do we support that? Why are we doing this at this scale? I think that, yeah, the reason is because we want to pay people well to do the work of relating and connecting. And I said, a friend of mine, Kara Lynch, who's an artist and activist who I love, I was talking about this kind of dynamic with her once, and she responded to me, yeah, well, white supremacy is so expensive. And I said, yeah, that's right. It takes up a lot of resources. White supremacist institutions, white supremacist way of working. And if we want to trouble that, it's additional labor. So it costs more money. So equity work needs far more resources, takes more time, and needs a lot more patience, even if the work that we're doing is indeed urgent. So I'll pause there, and Jamie, I'll pass it back to you to kick it to the next person in line.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to remind our attendees, please feel free to share any assumptions that you want to challenge about intermediaries in the chat as we go through our speaker intros. And Kate, I will pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jamie. I'm Kate Fox. I use she, her pronouns. I am located on unceded Potawatomi land, which is presently called Chicago. I work for the Center for Cultural Innovation, which is a California-based arts intermediary organization, which provides support to individual artists in California through regranting dollars provided by the government and institutional funders. We have an awesome and relatively new advocacy, public policy, research, and incubator that is currently called Soul Center for Liberated Work. And I am the director of the time-limited pooled fund called Ambitious. And Ambitious is a national funding initiative that invests in economic trailblazers from cultural communities under threat. And for us in particular, that means Black and Indigenous communities that are reimagining holistic economic systems that benefit people and planet. And we also fund experiments in artist ownership, and we take a very broad interpretation of that. Anyway, usually at this point in my introduction, when I'm talking with folks who don't know us, I see one of two things happening. So the first is the far off stare. So complicated, so much jargon. What is happening here? Or sometimes I see people typing away rapidly, trying to capture all the things that I'm saying so that they can make sense of it later on. And it just brings up this question of why are intermediaries so hard to understand? They're not funders, they're not exactly direct service nonprofits. And I wondered that myself. I'll just speak for myself when I worked in a private funding institution. And I still think about that idea, albeit obviously from a very different perspective. And here's where I'm at in trying to address that assumption, the complexity assumption. Why are we so complex? And I would say it's pretty simple. We, and I would say our sectors, I don't think that any of us would consider, or we should consider ourselves all part of one sector. I think we're probably working in lots of different places. We're trying to address really complex systemic problems. And naturally, those solutions also have to be complex. And intermediaries are a really important part of that. And all the things that Ron just said, helping to make funding more accessible, information more usable, strengthening organizational capacity, all sorts of things. I guess the other assumption, I'm throwing two in here because that's just how I do. The other assumption that I just want to put in there, which is related, is that sometimes when people think about categories like this, they think we're all kind of the same, and we aren't. So, and we'll get more into that as we go forward in the conversation. But those are two.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kate. And Sage, please.
Greetings, everyone. I'm laughing because Kate's second assumption was my assumption. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Greetings, everyone. My name is Sage Crump. My pronouns are she and her. I am a dark black-skinned woman with short hair, large glasses, and a bright orange top on a green background with, since we're talking earring game, I pulled out the Entezake Shanghai for colored girls who have considered suicide and rainbow isn't enough. Earrings that always give me good grounding when I'm speaking. I am currently Director of Racial Justice and Movement Building for the National Performance Network. NPN is a network of 56, I think, arts organizations across the country and artists that we support in developing new work to tour across the country in different communities. I was laughing because we didn't talk about our assumptions ahead of time. And so I was holding my breath, right? Until Kate said, I have a second one. And the second one assumption was the one I was bringing, which is the term intermediary is insufficient. It is insufficient to describe actually the umbrella term of everything that we're trying to ask it to hold. For a couple of reasons. I think first, when we go to the first Mentimeter was of course interesting. We're coming to a space around intermediaries, and what we saw were, art service organizations, regranting organizations, state arts organizations, foundations, like all of these different things are often coalesced under the term intermediary. And I have to credit Hao Wen Wang from Dance USA, who I think is on this call, is the first person who was like, this term intermediary just doesn't feel like, doesn't feel either the right term or robust enough. And at a gathering of a group of us in New York last year, and that stuck with me and still sticks with me. I don't know. And that sends me into two different directions. One, because we use the term intermediary to mean so much, it goes back to what Kate was offering, that we don't actually get clear about the power, privilege, positionality of all of those who call themselves intermediaries. What are our roles? And the sort of key cornerstone in that definition, what you offered, Jamie, earlier, is funding and resource, like the redistribution of funds. And I think that that is a tool for some and the main work of others, right? And that we can be in an interrogation of that more clearly, that allows us to create some distinctions amongst folks who are all called intermediaries, and therefore what it is we're actually doing in the world with these formations and with these organizations. The second part is, I think language is interesting. The whole phrase, like, words means things, words. And I'm often in this tension of finding a new name for something, being like, oh, that word doesn't work. Or when we reimagine the definition of a word based on current contexts. So even going back to the second slide, or maybe it's the last slide, I was keeping track, but do you know what an intermediary is? I think that's an investigation that we should all be in this current context, right? It's what it has been historically, specifically the proliferation of intermediaries coming out of trickle-down economics and Reagan theory, in the Reagan years, to where we are actually now, and what can an intermediary be, and what redistribution can mean in this current context in the world in which we're currently living in. So those are the assumptions. That's the assumption I would like to challenge. Thanks for the handoff, Kate.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So we're going to get into a couple of more questions rather. So firstly, I would just love to hear, what is the value of intermediaries? To Sage's earlier point, that's our encompassing term for today, but I heard, about that it is what, too limiting, right? Like I really hear that. But yeah, so for now, what is the value of intermediaries, in the arts and culture ecosystem? And can you provide examples of different ways support shows up through intermediaries? And again, we really want to keep, our audience engaged. So if folks have examples of different ways that support shows up through intermediaries, please feel free to share in the chat. But Sage, Kate, and Ron, whoever would love to start.
I'll jump in. We can reverse order. So as I was saying, I think one of the things that we get to do in this moment is look at the term intermediaries and put it in relationship to the world in which we currently live and what's necessary for the transformation of the world we live in. And I'm holding sort of two quotes as I think about the value of intermediaries. I think many of us have heard Jeff Chang for many years say, cultural change precedes political change, right? And then I think about Toni Morrison and her explanation, her belief that, all art is political. And if you say you are not being political, then you are, then that means you love the status quo, that the status quo is acceptable to you. And so when I think about the values of intermediaries, I wonder in our sector, where are the hubs where we get to create context together? I think intermediaries have a unique position that allows us to see context, trends, be able to support a sort of cohere, folks. It's information gathering, but information gathering and sharing for the sake of what? Right? When we are in moments where folks feel a need to organize, to connect with each other, to build power, intermediaries are often the hubs at which you get to find that, where you find each other, where you get to be in the conversations that are spaces that can be, and I believe can be, and are oftentimes the spaces that you're with peers that you trust. So you're in your most honest, and you have an opportunity to really go deep in the ways that we're talking about that we need to if we're going to address the complexity of the kinds of things that Ron and Kate and that we're all talking about and facing in this moment.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ron or Kate, would you like to add to that?
I can go. Yeah, what Sage shares is really beautiful, and I think that's where we'd like to go. One of the things that I was thinking about with Boulet's metaphor, right, of the mycelium, these fungal threads. I don't know how I feel about being referred to as a fungal thread, but I hear what he's saying, and I love Boo, and I'm a sucker for a good nature metaphor. But I just wanted to lift up some other metaphors that I was thinking about how the intermediaries show up right now. Oftentimes we are translators, right? We're translating from a funder who has a particular kind of language, wants to reach particular communities, and needs help making that connection and that bridge, and needs a trusted partner to do it. Ron mentioned that in his opening remarks. Sometimes the metaphor that feels appropriate is sometimes we have the role of the artist to push and conceptualize and stretch ideas and help redefine what's possible. Intermediaries can be nerve centers for our collective dreams, as Sage was encouraging in this last moment. And it's also a place where skills for the field get scaffolded. And one of the things I was thinking about, in particular, an experience that we had during the pandemic in Chicago, in order to mobilize funds from a whole variety of different funders, we had to create new infrastructure. And that was really the invitation was given to those of us who are in institutional funding positions by an intermediary. And so there are these really important connections because they see things sometimes that other folks can't see, because of the networks that we're operating in, and because we have a different mandate than either practitioners or funders. So that's what I would share.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ron, would you like to add to it?
Yeah, I just echo what Sage and Kate have shared. And Kate, it was actually something I was thinking about coming into this conversation about the roles that we play in the ecosystem. And one was adaptation, being able to really, as Sage, you were talking about, like engage with and understand context and then respond to that, to adapt to it. I think that is part of the role that we play in an ecosystem so often defined by entities that sort of are carrying the same thing, like doing things the same way. I think intermediaries are often positioned to be flexible, adaptable, and responsive. I think at our best, that's one of the ways that we can well function. And that was one of the stories I was thinking about, Kate, in terms of MAP's ways of being responsive and adaptive at the beginning of the pandemic, which is ongoing, COVID pandemic specifically. We were a part of a coalition of mostly intermediary organizations that were coming together around this project called Artist Relief, and distributed millions of dollars pretty quickly to artists at the onset. And I think that, you know, that was in the context of larger mutual aid projects and smaller mutual aid projects and many things that were happening at the time. But again, part of an ecosystem of activity that was responding to a crisis. And part of what I'm thinking about in terms of roles and importance of these kinds of institutions that we call intermediaries under this umbrella is that the things are going to continue to be crisis oriented, that we are going into a period of deepening crisis. I think anyone who is looking clearly and honestly at the world and the trajectory, not only in this country, but globally, if we're not dabbling in delusion, it's clear that we are in a time of escalating crises, overlapping and mutually reinforcing crises. And Sage, to your point, what an important time to have hubs where people can organize, where people can build power, where people can build analysis and side of that context and respond accordingly. So I think this work is only going to become more important, however it manifests. And I think intermediaries are one of those spaces, again, broadly defined, where that kind of thing can happen. Another story I'll just share, because Jamie, you asked us to provide examples, is in terms of adaptability and responsiveness. At MAP Fund, we've mostly given project grants to artists. That's been our mandate. It was MAP Fund has basically been a funder collaborative since its early inception at the Rockefeller Foundation, then moving into various organizational and like containers over the years. But that's been the mandate. And so in that programmatic funding and project-based funding, part of what's come out, and this was really in the early 2000s that it started to become a trend, is artists were coming to MAP Fund staff at the time and saying, I got this money to do this project, but I don't actually have the skills to pull it off. And not only that, but these co-presenting and producing institutions that I'm partnering with to bring my work out into the world are actually asking me to do producerial work and asking me to do this administrative and marketing stuff. I don't do that. I make art. That's not actually what I want to be doing. I want to be focusing on the work on the stage or wherever it's happening. And so this was a refrain that we were hearing. And so in response to that and in conversation with the artists who were coming back, that's how we developed the coaching program that we now call SPA, Scaffolding for Practicing Artists, is the spelled out version of the acronym. And we now offer this one-on-one support to a subset of the artists that we coach, as well as with the partnership with the Jerome Foundation, where we get to sit with artists and walk with them through whatever part of their journey they're on in this very responsive, adaptive, and artist-centered manner. And the transformative impact of that and its ability to resource the artists in ways that aren't monetary, but are so essential to making their work, their careers, their lives feel sustainable, good, and to ultimately happen, is really profound. And we wouldn't have done that necessarily had we not been creating a container of relationship where artists felt comfortable telling us, hey, you gave me this money and I can't use it. I can't use it in the best and highest way that I would like to. That's a delicate thing to say to someone, right? And how many funders have relationships, or institutions that give funding have relationships with the artists that they are funding, where that kind of conversation is possible, right? And that to me is part of this context of how we need to be working in these times of increasing crisis, where things aren't going to work as they have been working, where we are going to have more instances of starting and stopping or being fully turned around. And I think we're going to increasingly need these kind of hub spaces, these kinds of relationship-driven, equity-based, honest and transparent spaces where power can be troubled and challenged, to be vectors of resource redistribution, but also of, even more importantly, I think, connection and collaboration and co-conspiratorship. So something in there feels important in this time to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Sage, did you want to share a more specific example for this question?
I did. It was funny because I realized I didn't give an example, and then I heard Kate be like, and the dreams of things that like I was like, whoa, that's not a dream. Let me tell you about it. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight, and I think most people know, that prior to becoming the director of racial justice and movement building at NPN, I ran Leveraging a Network for Equity. And part of why I want to talk about Lane is because when I talk about what it means for folks to gather, learn together, grow their analysis, then what that becomes possible around the shifts in the material conditions is what we have learned over the course of Lane. Hello, Susan, glad you're here. We had 12 arts organizations that took 4 years each to both dig deeply to look into their own infrastructure, to reimagine their organizations, but as a body, as cohorts, they were in deep study together. They were in relationship building together. They began to develop an analysis for how they wanted to show up in the world. And that impacted them as a cohort. It impacted their local infrastructure. And it also then led to the development of the Department of Racial Justice and Movement Building, because what we understood is we have to work and scale, and we can work with the individual organizations and support their healing and their well-being. And also, we need to also work in the sector, and the sector needs to be guided by the things that they have learned and what has been shared amongst cohort members. So I wanted to talk about just sort of the ways in which the change actually happens, like our theory of change, which is supporting the deep internal work that then allows you to show up differently in the world. Once you have analysis about how you show up differently in the world and what the world is, then you step into it and create change for it. So I think that is the role that we played as sort of a hub for engagement for the network, for our cohort members, for them to grow and address the climate that they're existing in.
Yeah, thank you. And Kate, I think you wanted to add something as well.
Yes. And just a little bit of like deep, if not a little bit, a lot of deep admiration for the work that Sage and Ron are doing in living this future that we all deserve. I was thinking about, as Ron was talking about how complex the world is, and wow, it feels like it's only getting more complex. And we know that the ways that money moves through institutional philanthropy, it's not working well, and it's not working quickly enough. And another important role for intermediaries like ours is to flow that money differently, is to experiment, to serve as research and development for other institutional funders, to provide examples, case examples, just like the work of our colleagues here in demonstrating that a different future is possible, and we can hold each other with vulnerability, and we can become more effective. in following the lead of people in movement, versus creating our own strategies that may or may not be in alignment with what's actually needed, from folks who are the most experienced and the experts who can actually tell us how to move. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I do want to pause for a second in a moment of transparency and just check in with speakers. Are we feeling like we want to continue a group discussion or go into breakout rooms and have some more direct conversations with folks in attendance? So we can do so with about 10 people per room for a comfortable moving forward that way.
I'll just say selfishly, this is a pretty incredible room. And I'm watching the chat, and there are people who are, and so I think as a larger conversation, we could also collectively learn from what some of the folks who are right now just keeping the chat brilliant, and we might be able to hear some of their voices. So
Awesome. Well, we will proceed that way. I'm just dropping a link in the chat for our attendees to be able to really engage in this next part of our discussion. And you can add some notes on the slides because everyone should have access to edit them. But we're kind of going to go into two different scenarios here, right? We'll start with scenario one, which would be a future in which intermediaries have been divested, right? And really thinking about what are the potential field impacts of divestment from intermediaries, what happens to the ecosystem when intermediaries disappear, and what are the implications of shifting resources and dynamics for artists employed by intermediaries. These questions are also in the chat for everyone. So please feel free, we'll have our speakers share aloud, but if attendees want to keep adding notes or any points in the chat as well as to the slides, I encourage you to do so. So from our folks up here, whoever would like to begin. It's a very loaded question, so I know we're not gonna, be able to hit all parts, but at least we're starting, right? We're starting here.
I kind of want to put Kate on the spot as the first one to start now, and then we'll kind of go around.
Kate, are you comfortable with that?
I mean, I feel very selfish about this, but it would be disastrous, like it would, the flexibility, the ability to nimbly engage lots of different actors to bring a level of credibility with many different groups. Man, it doesn't, both at intermediaries exist in local communities, right? In particular practices, they exist regionally, they exist nationally, and oftentimes they pop up because there's a need that's not getting met, and because folks get together and say, we are doing our work, but we are having a hard time doing this next thing that will help impact our work and help impact the people that we're serving, because we don't have this kind of infrastructure. And so oftentimes that's how the intermediary structure gets gets utilized, which is why there's so many different kinds of intermediaries, right? Like so the idea of divestment is one that I think brings a lot of risk, and puts a lot of I mean, it's just I don't know how else to say disastrous, but like, I do think disastrous, and I think in part because if you think about the ligaments and the things in your joints, I don't know, this is I'm putting all the metaphors out there right now. When you don't have them, your joint stiffens and you actually can't move, and it just, like I said at the beginning, intermediaries are complex, and sometimes it's hard for funders to understand their value, but that arm would not move without intermediaries. So, okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Ron or Sage, would you like to add?
I mean, I think we can just pop just one thing that's coming to mind. this is less of what would happen or the field impacts and more like a analysis. I think what I think is important to name is that I think we be clear that this is not like an idea, like this is something that's unfolding right now. Something that's unfolding right now. And there are shifts happening in our funding ecosystem, broadly speaking, nationally, that are increasingly away from at least some national intermediaries. So this is an actual, that's why we're having this conversation in part, just to be very transparent about it. This is not theoretical. Now, that's not to say that intermediaries would disappear in this moment, but it is to say that there is a trend unfolding, and it's curious to think through, okay, well, what are the implications if this were to be an ongoing trend and pattern, right? And so I think for me, part of what's missing is that responsiveness. Because as I think one thing I wanted to say is that artists are going to make their work, culture workers are going to be doing the work of making and creating culture, like tradition bearers are going to continue to move forward, traditions that are living, like people will find a way. The question is, what's the quality of that endeavor? And how well resourced or supported will it be? And how are we marshaling the resources that we have at our disposal within these institutions, whatever their form, whatever we want to call them, to make that work as powerful as it can be, and in my mind, as easeful as it can be, right? How do we not struggle when we don't have to, right? How do we not suffer more than need be? And so I think in my mind, like the disappearance of intermediaries as we understand them now, is just unstrategic. It's just not strategic. And I think in this field often utilize this language of ecosystem without really thinking through what it actually means. If we were to embody these metaphors, if we were to really be thinking and our analysis and praxis were rooted in an understanding of the natural world of which we are a part, but have separated ourselves from due to colonialism, all these other isms and oppressive systems and structures, right? Like, so we're in this battle, we're in this tension place. And I think it prevents us from actually thinking and being ecosystemically, ecological thinking and analysis. And so what I think is missing is that we are not in harmony and collaboration in the ways that natural ecosystems actually are, where the resources go where they're needed. They aren't hoarded by the few, right? There's so many ways. I mean, that's a whole other conversation to a large part, but like that we just don't function that way. But I think at minimum, to create a structure as we have in the arts and culture field nationally here in the US, and then to remove this interstitial piece or to weaken it even without strategic or clear thought about what the implications of that actually are, which is what we're doing here, kudos GIA, is just really silly and fraught and short-sighted. And I will cease to use all this judgmental language, but it's not how we need to be moving, particularly in a time of great crisis, you know? And so I think that that's my thing is, I guess, the potential field impacts are an even less ecosystem orientation toward resourcing arts and culture and sustaining arts and culture as it's practiced in its many forms in this country. So I think that's my thing, is it weakens our ability to move in the way that we say we want to be moving, equitably, ecosystem-wise, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Sage, we'll go to you in just a second. I just wanted to uplift a couple of things that folks are saying on the slide here. The voices highlighted in the field would become less diverse. Divested equals would close impact on the ecosystem equals greater isolation and fracturing in the ecosystem. Intermediaries help to bring the field together. Without them, there is competition and meism. I think funders would have to individually absorb the knowledge of intermediaries in-house, very insufficient. If intermediaries disappear, they would need to be recreated. Loss of trust in the field. I believe we are resilient and would find another way to organize and respond. It would be a heavy load and time consuming, but we can. loss of such a robust and rich resource, meeting point, mode of knowledge, artists not feeling connected to everyone in the field beyond their immediate communities, more difficult for artists to access resources, increased power imbalance between funders and grantees. I also want to uplift what Kita said in the chat. The system is already unbalanced. It will further unbalance things if we take away the supports that intermediaries provide without providing those supports in other ways. The conversations about not funding intermediaries don't include the things that artists need to make our work, i.e. food, shelter, income, etc., and for artists to create work with others collaboratively. We need artist support, project support, people support, growth support. Eleanor said, I agree that disinvestment in intermediaries is disastrous. The investment prior to this time has created incredible infrastructure and a field of people with deep relationship and knowledge of artists and various arts fields. There has already been disruptions for artists due to pandemic and uprising. The systems and paths for artists are collapsed, and the loss of intermediaries would implode capacity. This will reduce the capacity of funders. So I encourage folks to keep adding things in, and we'll also share out the chat and the slides after this conversation as well, so that everyone can review what folks are saying. But Sage, please.
Absolutely. I'm sort of picking up some of what Ron was putting down. I immediately, when this came up, I started thinking about my garden in my backyard, right? Like, and thinking about we're using the term mycelium, right? Like, what happens when I don't water the soil and it dries and things die, right? Like the ability that's it's not necessarily the question of like the individual pieces of it, but that the matter that holds it together, the matter that connects, the matter that feeds, the matter that transfers information, when that gets when that is reduced, that is part of what we're saying is what many of us are saying around what dies. I think there are a couple of things I really appreciate what Ron said also about the quality that artists are going to make work. And there was someone else who was like, we can reimagine. Absolutely. And there are consequences to every decision, right? Right. There are consequences. There are consequences in terms of the times when there's an opportunity for something, right? And we let sort of the opportunity to do something pass us by. Like there are inflection moments where there is more possibility than at other times. Things aren't static and always the same around at the same time. And we have been in an inflection moment where we know we are seeing the cracks and crises. And we know that that also means that there's opportunities. And the idea that intermediaries are places where we can experiment, places where we can try things, that we have a nimbleness that other places don't, means that as the hub of figuring out what to do from this moment to the next in what's called the interregnum, in the in-between time, that we can be the places that help do that. And so to lose that means we keep trying to put old things onto new terrain. We keep trying to layer Band-Aids on wounds that are getting larger. And that can get you to a point, but that doesn't get you to the next evolutionary leap. What I also want to say is this: the question of divestment for me is also a question of what values we say we hold and what our actions say about those values, right? That we understand that intermediaries, for whatever that word could mean, are places that people are. Someone mentioned, I think already in the that you read, Jamie, are places where we're seeing more diversity. That intermediaries are places that where we can lean into, not just because the intermediaries need to exist, but because we need pathways to address historical systemic harms and imagine new places and new ways to live in a world that needs to shift so it can hold dignity, humanity for all of us. In our sector, I say sometimes, I feel like our sector has a little self-esteem problem. Like our sector matters in the transition of the world we live in, right? And so the divestment of the intermediaries, and I think this is again going back to the thing I want us to be clear about is that this is not true that of all intermediaries, right? Like who's doing what, where our values suggest we should invest in, right? For the sake of what, right? And that as the different intermediaries, as we call ourselves now, understand that about the work that we do, about its role in the world, as we articulate that, then that matches, then that helps us live our values, and it supports others living their values by supporting the work that we do. Right? I feel that was a little place, but I think I landed somewhere.
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. So now I want to shift us into a different scenario, right? So we've talked about divestment, how that is happening right now. So Ron, thank you so much for uplifting that. Now looking at intermediaries reconceptualized. So what would a reimagined intermediary look like? How can we reconceptualize the role of intermediaries to better serve communities in the future? What does it mean to do the work with care towards grantees? And how can we ensure intermediaries are adequately resourced to do this care work? So folks can use that same link on the slides. I see that some people have already started to add comments on the second slide now. You'll see where it says scenario 2. So please keep doing so and sharing in the chat. And Sage, would you like to kind of reverse the order here and start? Or if anyone is like dying to start?
I can't ask Kate to start and then step back when I'm out. That wouldn't be right. I feel like I think about this all day, all the time, right? One of the things I think part of my work is in the sector we call this field the art and culture sector, and I also do a good bit of work in justice spaces. And one of the things I often tell them is, y'all wish you had the infrastructure we did, right? They're out there base building, they're trying to grow certain things, and we have these hubs that have already existed for decades that we serve, we support, we resource. And what would happen if we began to align folks with each other, if we began to cohere an agenda, if we began to think about more deeply what becomes possible when we are explicit about our cultural organizations and our sector as an engaged part of the transformation of the world we live in, right? And so I think when I talk about reconceptualizing the role of the intermediaries, I think about who are our strategic partners. Sometimes they're in the field and sometimes they're not. When we're talking about resourcing, going back to Kita's part in the chat about resourcing where people live, wages. There are folks who have been doing this work for decades. How are artists a part and seen as workers and a part of this work, right? And we have to wrestle with in this country, there's this contradiction around artist and how we think about artists, right? Like it's an exceptional class, right? Oh, artist. Oh, you're an artist. Oh my goodness, how wonderful. Oh my, you get to be an artist, right? Like it's some kind of privilege and not an actual calling or a job, right? Like or body of work. And then I often, most of the artists I know live below the poverty level, right? That's the majority of artists in this country, right? That don't have access to healthcare, that don't have, unless they're doing something else, right? Like but cannot survive with the resources that they need in their lives as artists, as what they came here to the planet to do and offer, right? And so when I reconceptualize intermediaries, I think about where we also creating new connections that integrate. I always say it's the distinction between exceptionalism and integration. Right? Where we as artists, as a sector, integrating ourselves, seeing ourselves as part of, and finding our allies within other sectors that are thinking about these things as well, so that we're thinking about what care means, right? Like what care means holistically for the life of the work. I'm looking at the questions I'm answering because I feel like I'm answering the first part of it and maybe not the second. And how can we ensure intermediaries are adequately resourced to do this care work? I think there are folks that when we are more clear, that may not be in the art and culture sector that would love to be fellow travelers with us. And sometimes, you know, you go home with the people that brung you, and sometimes you meet some new folks. And I think that we are in, again, an inflection point where and I love what our necessity, and I love what Hal Wen said that earlier, our necessity to the cultural life of society can be seen somewhere else. And I think that when I think about adequately resourced, I think we need that within the sector. And I'm also like, I'm tired of knocking on doors that don't open. You know, I'm trying to figure out what else is possible. And I think as intermediaries, that's a conversation that we can be having with each other. Right?
Yeah, thank you so much. Ron, would you like to share?
Yeah, I have a jumble of thoughts. I had things prepared, but now I'm just feeling, I don't know. It's a lot of swirl. Forgive any incoherence. But the thing that's coming to mind for me is that I don't know how much reimagining we have to do. I think that there's already work happening. You know, I just feel like, to me, that suggests like a doing again. And maybe in terms of like finding what's working, finding what has worked, and reconfiguring institutions to look like that. But anyway, I don't think this is about reinvention or doing the new necessarily. I also am an artist, and I have this project that I've been working on for many years called the Spiritual Technologies Project. And part of what we've been doing as a group of Black artists is looking at embodied tools and knowledge from communities of practice, largely based in the South, largely in the rural places where I grew up, in what's now called Georgia, Muskogee lands, and thinking about how technologies, for example, congregational singing in Black churches, is a powerful tool that, when contextualized now, if we were to really re-socialize these forms of singing, could really be powerful resources for movements, right? Like the intelligence of that work, as we were conceptualizing it, was to say that like this work is about resonance. It's about how we vibrate together. That's not just a metaphorical thing. It's a physical practice of attunement so that we can be in right relationship with each other as we go out into this very dangerous context. We're talking about the Jim Crow South, right? In which we're talking about enslavement, not even just the Jim Crow South, right? And so, you know, we were thinking about that in that project as saying, like, how do we bring this important practice into the present in a more alive way, in a recontextualized way that can allow us to actually move powerfully now, albeit differently in terms of context, right? And so I just want to say that I think there are things that we don't have to create or recreate even, or re-elaborate, but even in recontextualizing my work, what that looks like, I don't know. I just don't think we have to all do new stuff. I also think, I'm thinking, the other thing that's coming to mind for me is the global response to the COVID pandemic that began in 2020. And that, again, is ongoing. As a chronically ill and disabled person who is largely isolated from society now, it feels very important for me to say this over and over again in any time I can. So as we look at what we did in 2020, as hard as that was, we did all kinds of stuff. All these rules, all of these ways of being that we thought institutionally, let's just say in arts and culture, we had to move, reports that we needed, application forms and information that we required, pace at which we could get funds out the door. A lot of that went to the wayside, largely due to advocacy from intermediary organizations to some of these larger funding organizations, mind you, to say like, all of that stuff, nah, we're not doing that. We need to get resources to people right now. And it happened. And what's happened since? We've gone right back to doing the thing that we were doing before. Why didn't we keep doing that? Why not? That would be a great field conversation to have again and again, right? Why didn't we, what lessons have we brought forward from that, right? Like, I don't know, because we're not talking about it. And I think part of that's rooted in trauma. Part of that's rooted in all kinds of things that we just would rather not look at, including why we don't have public health in this country anymore in the wake of what was the beginning of the pandemic, right? But we can draw the same through lines of not wanting to do the difficult work of evolution toward what we say we're about, to Sage's point, when we could just go back to the status quo because that's where we're comfortable, or because we haven't had time to grieve the things that we've lost, because we haven't made that collective space to do so. So rather than carry the lessons forward, we abandon them to go back to what feels more comfortable in the short term, knowing that the long-term consequences of that are unsustainable as well, right? So I think we're doing that the same way. We already know some things that we can do. We don't have to do it all over, but what we have to do is commit to the discomfort of moving through the present toward the future that we say we want. So that's my thing. Like, we need to be having the difficult conversations. We need to be telling the truth. We need to be willing to hear it from the people who we don't have to listen to. And we need to make those spaces available much more frequently. I think these kind of fundamental practice points, to me, feel like the reimagination, which is also just the through line from what we say we already are about, that we just need to do more of. And I think that's not just on intermediaries, that's on these big funders, that's on all of us in our communities and our day-to-day practices. What is care? What does care look like if you can wear a mask and you choose not to, when you know that that could cause people to die? Because of your actions, you could create a material conditional change in the environment that you're in, but why do you choose not to do that, right? We can ask the same questions of ourselves in all of these other things. Why do we choose not to be moving with care when we otherwise could? We need to do that deep personal, interpersonal, and organizational work and be really honest about it. I think that's part of the calling, is toward integrity, and no excuses because we're in these little ivory towers that are false, that have been created. Like, what does it mean to actually be in integrity? Start small. That feels, I'm gonna stop preaching. I'm gonna stop howling. I'm gonna stop preaching. I'm gonna pass it to Kate.
I mean, what else is there really to say there? I mean, you've kind of given us what we need to hear. I would just add to Howland's point in the chat, we do have a moment to reimagine the container and what we call it, to communicate the value. That is both an external thing, but it also is an internal thing. You know, the words that we use really do matter. I love this idea, Ron, that you're bringing up about the fact that we don't have to reimagine. And Sage was saying, like, we don't have to start from scratch. There are places and practices that are happening that have longevity, and we can join them. We can be part of that conversation. And I really, as you were talking about that idea of singing, and Blasher put in here attunement, which I think is a really important word, this idea of the fact that we need to listen harder. We need to stop talking about all this stuff. We need to listen to what the field is telling us, and that, I think, is something that intermediaries often do well. And I also want to just acknowledge that I'm not saying that intermediaries are universally good or they're universally bad, right? There's a whole spectrum. But I do think that the opportunity to not only listen harder, but bring what we're hearing to the relationships that we have is an important role. And to Sage's larger point, I was thinking about this idea of, gosh, we're always caught up in reactive mode. And what does it mean for us? And that's our invitation to be proactive. And not just in our sector, as Sage was encouraging, right? But outside of our sector, with people who are aligned with this work. So yeah, I too don't know that it has to be a completely reimagined structure, but I do think that we need to think really creatively about the structures that we have and how we can mobilize differently.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do want to uplift some things that folks are adding to the slides. The pilot/experimental culture of intermediaries can also lead to proliferation of a one-off pilot programs that leave artists without longer-term impact solutions. Intermediaries should work together to create longer-lasting transformative change. How does a new pilot program interact, support, leverage other pilot programs to achieve broader movement building, systemic changing impact that serve more than just a few, host political education series around the history of intermediaries and current economic and political standing in the spectrum of community development and change. It takes time, the space to experiment, to innovate. Intermediaries would provide that space for themselves, the sector, and those we connect with. Show me your budget, I'll tell you your values. Pay staff better. Care work is deep, meaningful, and asking. No more quote unquote pay to play policies to access funding. Shouldn't have to be a member to apply for a grant. We do the non-artistic work on behalf of artists. The work is valuable, but cannot be quantified. One of the largest resources is funding both for artists and actual individuals doing the labor, not replicating harmful institutional practices to make ourselves and grantees more palatable to funders. Another, care needs time to remove the pressure to quote unquote produce. Funding for intermediaries to have the time for R&D to work with artists to build models for deep support. And I do want to uplift how Ann said earlier in the chat, and Sage, you also mentioned this in one of your earlier responses, but just around the word intermediaries. And so how Ann said language matters. The word intermediary implies a pass-through of funds as our primary function and identity. The word says nothing about why we are not just valuable, but necessary. And so with that, I would love to just end, speakers, if I'm kind of throwing one at you here, but just one word that you feel, I guess, better encompasses what intermediaries are, or what you want to come to folks' minds. I know in the beginning we like ask people what is a word that comes to your mind when you think about intermediaries. I encourage attendees as well, like please share in the chat. What is a word that feels like it fits better, so to say, even minding, right, that like fitting, and we're still like limiting things in that context. But I know like for me, even after like this conversation today, I'm very much a visual learner, but I'm thinking core, right? Like core, foundation, the ground. And this idea where if you take it away, like everything else collapses, especially hearing all this talk about the ecosystem and all of these connecting fibers, like it not just existing out there, but holding everything together, right? And being what everyone is able to build upon, all of that work and care. I'm really taking away the word about care and integrity and centering community, and everything kind of being like together. So I'm seeing this in my head. So that was my best description of that. But Sage, Ron, and Kate, please, like what's one word or phrase or a couple of words that are coming to mind for you?
One of the core questions I'm asking right now is, can or in what ways are cultural organizations political instruments? And in the time of the election coming up, when you hear the word political, folks, have all kinds of like electoral, blah, blah, blah. What does that mean about how we engage? I'm going to encourage us to go and look at the way Toni Morrison, if we're going to be in this sector, the way Toni Morrison talks about politics and what that means about the relationship between art and politics, and politics being I think actually, you can look at what Toni Morrison said. I think this is also Jeff, that politics is the art of possibility, and politics is the possibility of culture, and culture is the art of possibility, right? And just thinking again about the ways in which, I guess when you said one word, I gave two, political instruments, and thinking about the role that we play in the development of the work and for the sake of what.
Thank you. Ron or Kate, whoever would like to go first. And also still, thank you, Alexandra. Alexandra says in the chat, network builders, uplifters, champions.
I feel if I had a better term, I would use it. Like, I'm not holding out. It's just like, it is really difficult. And it kind of depends on what kind of intermediary you are. But I guess I would, not to not answer the question, but I guess as we've been talking about the container that we call intermediary, I've been thinking a lot about, I know this is going to sound weird, but nerve cells, right? These things, these electric cells that are in our body that are sending messages back and forth between things, communicating, directing. And if I have bungled my science, I apologize. But you know, I just think of something that's the word intermediary really does have that connotation of a transaction, and like things move through us versus the way that things typically go, which is we're shaping things as they come to us and go back. And so I don't know what the, maybe English is not the right language to even go to for a word like that, but that's the visual I think about.
I'm really thinking about care work. I'm really thinking about that in the context of disability justice, thinking about the work of Sins Invalid, for example, and other arts and cultural workers who have been doing work at the intersections of those practices with disability justice. So I'm trying to think of a word that can hold care, but and something else. I don't know. I think that the word that's coming to mind for me is stewardship. Which I think could be, you know, very broadly understood. I think it can hold multitudes, I guess. But to me, stewardship is about like a sort of rigorous, like a diligent, ongoing form of care. And that's how I would like to be. That's the kind of institutions that I would like to be a part of. I'm seeing some really good stuff, nurturers and doulas in the chat. I like doula. So yeah, I think steward is where I'm landing right now. And also just to say, like, I really appreciate, of course, engaging with Sage and Kate, who I like to think with so much. And just say, you know, I know that we're not representative of this diverse field, right? That we've been talking about are these many forms of institutions and practices. And so just really grateful for the folks who have been active in the chat. And I hope this can be an ongoing conversation. I think it's really important and necessary for our field to continue to speak and think about this rigorously. So yeah, stewardship, accountability, integrity, care. Those are some of the words, not works, and works that we need to be about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you to Sage, Kate, and Ron. Thank you so much to Jess and Allie from Looking Glass Creative, who helped us with all of our tech today. In closing, today's webinar has underscored the vital role these entities play within the arts and culture sector. Intermediaries act as essential connectors, facilitators, and advocates, ensuring that resources and opportunities reach the communities that need them most. Our discussion has highlighted the necessity for these organizations to adapt and respond to the evolving needs of the field. By championing, oh my goodness, y'all, sorry, innovative practices and prioritizing equity, intermediaries are crucial in paving the way for a more inclusive and vibrant arts landscape. GIA's commitment to transforming traditional grant-making practices and fostering equity aligns with the goals of these organizations. As we advance, it is imperative to continue investing in intermediaries to amplify their impact, driving towards a more equitable future in the arts. We encourage you to share feedback with us on your experience today through the link in the chat or through this QR code. Webinar registrants will also receive a follow-up email with a recording of today's webinar. We'll have a PDF of the chat as well as the slides that everyone added to. Thank you so much for folks who left words there. And we hope to see you in the coming weeks. We'll have our announcement for an upcoming September webinar. We also hope to see you in person in Chicago at the GIA conference, which will be from October 6th to 9th. And early bird registration will open up on August 6th. More information on that soon. But thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day. Take care.